This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
You can't really understand the long spiritual war in which you are deployed unless you understand what happened in Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me is a gentleman who has devoted a lot of time and a lot of research, like Sharon and me, into the meaning of those verses and the implications thereof for us today. He's the author of the best-selling book, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and he's now back with the Genesis 6 Conspiracy Volume 2. It is our honor to welcome back to the program Gary Wayne. Gary, thanks for taking time out of your schedule to join us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and so happy to be back in the bunker so we can talk about things that, I think some of the best interviews and shows I've enjoyed have been with you because I absolutely value your research and your insights. And, I don't know whether we're two peas in a pod, but we certainly have the same sort of drive to get at things for the readers and for Christians in general to have informed information in the world we live in to make better decisions on. And I really love what you said about Genesis 6, 1 through 4. It's my premise that it's unfortunate that the church today, for the most part, doesn't teach the whole Bible in its full context. So it tries to stay away from prehistory in unusual ways, and it likes to stay away from prophecy. And so you have great values taught, but you don't get the context. You don't get our raison d'etre as to why we're here. Mm-hmm. And so, I think if you want to understand the Bible, you better understand prehistory in Genesis, because everything feeds off of what happens as to what we're told there. So,
Sharon and I liken it to
pleasure to be here.
And likewise, we're triangulating on the same information and looking for the implications for our world today. But I think you're right. Without understanding what happened in the beginning of the prehistory, most churches, I think, will start with Genesis 11. Maybe they'll teach Babel as a lesson against pride. Yeah. But a lot of them will start with Genesis 12 and Abraham. And then most of them will skip Revelation altogether. And Sharon and I liken that to trying to build a house with no foundation and no roof. You get a little rain and the walls start to fall in because you don't have anything holding it up and nothing to keep out the slings and arrows of the enemy, especially for kids going off to college these days.
And it's probably a better metaphor than what I was using in terms of the building and the foundations, but it's absolutely true. So, that's why in the subtitle to part 2, the title and the subtitle is How Understanding Prehistory and Giants Helps to Define End Time Prophecy. Yeah. That there is so much context in some of the what a lot of people think are sort of obscure allegories in Revelation or other parts of the Bible about the end time, but it's all defined within the Bible, and it's all sort of given to us to understand the end time as you understand Babel in this example. How does that connect to Babylon? Well, it's a direct relationship in so many different ways, and yet, as you say, it's rarely taught in the full context. Mm-hmm. So not of what was, what is, and what will be.
Absolutely. And we just talked to Tyler Gilbert about his new book called Gate of the Gods, which draws exactly that connection between Babel and Babylon. And so we're triangulating on the same information. And when you dig into the Hebrew, you find some really, really fascinating things. But your book, this is part 2 of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy. Your first book was, if I remember right, something like 900 pages. Is that right?
Over 800, but less 800? Than 9.
Okay.
Yeah. If there's a distinction there, that's important. I don't know.
Well, that's about three of my books, okay, in terms of length. So what more could be said that was not said in your first book? Why did you write the part 2?
And for those reasons, I said I would never write a sequel to... But, there's that old story that, along the way to the Colosseum, things kind of changed. A funny thing happened, yeah. Yeah, a funny thing happened. And the funny thing that happened was it's not that I mistargeted book one. It did exactly what I wanted it to do. I wanted to show Christians and non-Christians alike that there's a common history. We may see it through a polytheist lens or a monotheist lens, depending on what belief system that you're in. But if you're talking about prehistory, it tells the same story all around the world. If you're talking about post-Diluvian prehistory, it tells the same story, history. And similarly, those religions that are the basis for the culture of the polytheist countries, or the Gentile nations, as they were more understood from a Hebrew perspective, is that they have a similar ideology for the end time, just a different outcome. And so we're all talking about the same sorts of things. And this is the world that we live in, that's dominated by the polytheist world. And we live in that. And it's everywhere. We're absolutely immersed in it. So, and that with Christians, though, they said, this is a really good book. And you open our eyes to so many things. We can understand the world very, very well today. But what we would like is you to maybe focus your research capability and do something that hasn't been done in terms of the way that they were responding to what they wanted me to do. And that was to go deeper into the Bible than anybody has ever gone before, into prehistory, and then show us how that has an implication from a Christian perspective for the end time. And so book one is showing basically how the Bible intersected, or how the rest of the world intersects with the Bible. And I let the spurious forces, the polytheists, talk for themselves. So I wasn't, wanting to manipulate their words. I wanted Christians to hear in their own words what they believe and what they're doing with that belief system.
Right, right.
And so book two is more showing how the Bible does the reverse of that connection. So it is the centerpiece, and I only use outside sources to give a little bit more clarity as to what's going on. So I think Genesis 6 Conspiracy Book 1 was probably is an absolutely unique book in the genre, that it's distinct from anything else that is out there and covers so much material. And Book 2 is just as unique, but differently. It's unique because I would look at it in my terms as it's book one on steroids for Christians. And secondly, if you're a fan of Dr. Heiser or yourself, then it is book two on Gilbert steroids or Heiser steroids. And so from two different levels, one from the research that you do in so many other cultures and see the connections. And with Heiser, he did a lot on that. I didn't get into that level in book one because the book was so complicated and big already. I didn't want to get deep into the Hebrew and deep into the Greek and deep into the etymology. But this book sort of demands it, because one of the issues that happens with understanding the English translation is it doesn't capture the whole context of the original Hebrew word or the Greek word, and that you're trying to use one or two words to capture that meaning isn't really sufficient. So you miss some of it. I'm not saying they chose wrongly. I'm saying they should have put more into it. And then the other thing that I wanted to make sure that people understand, that if you do go to the original Greek and original Hebrew for the two testaments respectively, then there's a discipline that's required. That each of those words has multiple meanings, some of them nuanced, some of them antithetical to each other in terms of the application, seemingly. And so you have to pick the right translation and understanding for the sentence, for the verse, for the chapter, and that it never conflicts with however you might want to look at that meaning anywhere else in the Bible. And that's a very high standard, but that's the standard that if you're going to do the research, you want to try and hold yourself to, not that we can be perfect. So, so I didn't want to be redundant in book two, but so I didn't really know how to write it if I was going to write it. And I was in the middle of writing another book that I set aside to do this. And then as I got going and I found out why I was struggling with my other book, and I learned how to write book 3 by doing book 2. So I wouldn't have been so stiff-necked. Maybe I would have been a little bit further along on the process.
I get it.
Yeah, and another thing I did that's differently is that instead of having endnotes, and there's over 100 pages of endnotes in book one, I put all of the annotations as footnotes on the same page because there's so much information on the same page. Read the verse, look down at the footnote if you want, read more of what's in there, and you see the source, you can check the veracity, you can see what I'm doing with it or any of the other information I want to put in there. So so it's unique in a lot of ways. And as I go through, the first half of the book, the first two sections, to me, for any Christian that's out there, it's essential reading to understand the Bible. Whether or not one concludes with all of my conclusions or research, that's not the point of the book. The point is here's information that you need to understand and deal with that in your understanding of the world that we live in, based on that. And then as I get beyond the first couple sections, that lays the platform to talk about who these various tribes that Israel was up against. And this is more a post-Diluvian book than an antediluvian book.
Okay.
Right.
So after the flood as opposed to before, right?
Yeah, and with post-Diluvian giants versus antediluvian giants, which I'll explain, I think, biblically, the difference why we have Rephaim and why we have Nephilim as a distinction in the giants. And that as you get into the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and 1 Chronicles, you have 70 patriarchs. But 9 of those patriarchs with Canaan's clans, there are only 3 are named: Canaan, Heth, Heth and Sidon. And why are they patriarchless? There's a reason for that, and that these are. I will start to take each of those tribes back, as I call them, the hybrids, back to a specific Rephaim patriarch, who they're eponymically named after.
Okay.
And then I'll move into the Rephaim, world order, or the Rephaim post-Diluvian hegemony that is put in place. And then I'm going to track all the names of the giants for tribes, even though there are many names that people won't maybe recognize at first, but I'll show you how to recognize that this might be a giant tribe and what that patriarch is and how we link that back to a specific Rephaim patriarch, and to many to a specific celestial mafia godfather. I like to use that term just because it's kind of funny, but pretty appropriate in terms of what they do on their oath-based society and all the different meanings that sort of go with it. So, and so that lays down all the information that people need to understand the wars of the giants after the flood. So even though in book 1 in Genesis 14 I cover it, but I cover it in a way that has never been covered in terms of how we know these are Rephaim kings involved in most of the nations, the difference between the hybrids there and the giant nations, and that the Mesopotamian kings can be traced back to giant roots as well, using the same type of sources, whether or not it's patronymic, eponymous, or patrial, and other sources to arrive at that sort of nexus point that this was a giant, and this was a tribe that was named after a giant. And when I talk about patrial, if people aren't really familiar with that sort of term, or eponymous is just a tribe named after a patriarch, right? And patrial is like Mount Seir, so you have Seir as in the Dukes of Edom, for example, or a city like Hamath or something like that is named after a specific Rephaim, which was typically done in prehistory. So then I cover this giant war, which is probably the greatest war since the flood, and maybe for a long time after, maybe not even equaled into the time of the Exodus wars. And then after that, then I get into the battles of Israel and how we recognize that they're fighting against hybrids and giants, both, and the difference between them and the different battles. So, obviously I'm going to revisit Rephaim, which I did in book 1, but didn't call Rephaim. And then I'm going to move after the flood, cover the battle of Atharim, which leads to the Eastern campaign. I cover the complete Eastern campaign, then the Central and Southern campaign after crossing the Jordan, and I go through this in complete detail biblically and give you details and information that to sort of bring these battles and peoples to life. And then the Northern campaign, and then the Mountain and Southern cleanup campaign again. And then after that, I move into the book of Judges and identify the wars that they're fighting against hybrids and giants in the age of the Judges, and how we know that that's the case biblically, all the way through to King Saul, King David, and then through King Solomon, down through the Hadad patronymic dynasties of Baal.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This looks like a really, really interesting read, and I intend to make this a priority to read, because I want it to supplement what, the direction that Sharon and I have gone. Your first book did a better job, I think. It's the first book, maybe the only book I've seen that really does a good job of connecting Genesis 6 to the secret societies and their teachings to this day. Yeah. Very unique in that respect. You do a really deep dive into the historical foundation of all this and the biblical basis for this, which is something that Sharon and I have studied. We wrote about in Veneration, but again, in about a quarter of the pages. So obviously we didn't get into the detail that you did. But and we may not interpret all of the data the same way, which is fine, because none of us pretends to have all of the answers here. Yeah,
just to further the investigation for other people to pick up and continue.
Absolutely. So just for some foundational information, people who may not be familiar with the difference between the terms Nephilim, Rephaim, Gibborim, and what are their relations to demons and angels?
Yeah, so I've labeled that in the first section in chapters. So chapter 3 is Nephilim, Gibborim, and Rephaim, and then right behind it in chapter 4 is demons, devils, and unclean spirits. So it's that sort of base information, because as the book moves into sections, 6 and 7, I'm moving into end time prophecy, and I'm also adding more information in that transition to give an end time sort of chronology, and using my approach, which I explain in the preface of the book, so people can understand how I get there, whether or not they agree with my approach or not. That's a whole different issue. So I cover off the Jesuits, which I don't cover off in book 1, and how that connects into the Catholic Church and the Mary apparitions, and as it transitions into the end time prophecy. And I give Jesuits a lot of space there, and I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole in book 1, because the book was already very, very large, and I laid the basis for it. So again, additional information. So chapter 3, Nephilim, Gibborim, and Rephaim, essential information. So first of all is, as we've already talked about, I understand giants in a distinction as before and after the flood, that there's something different, probably not as large. Something has changed in the immortality nature that they were originally gifted, both physically and spiritually. And as I noted, not as large, and also a distinction in their ability to reproduce. Something changes, and I think something changes probably in Genesis 6:3, in the creation of the giants and the preamble to the flood story, where you have life limited to 120 years, both for the Adamites, the Canaanites, and for the giants. So that even though they have a counterfeit immortal spirit, that body's not going to remain immortal. And and that's the soul and the body, or the dwelling place for the spirit, that is going to release the counterfeit spirit upon death. And so something's changing there. And so Nephilim is only used 3 times in the Old Testament, which is most people aren't really aware of, because giant appears a lot more than 3 times. So it appears in Genesis 6:4, and it appears in Numbers 13:33 twice, when it refers to the Anak, or the Anakim, as I call them, and also they're listed Anakim a couple times in the Bible as that plural. And I tend to use the I am suffix to label all the giants versus the ites, which because I don't think Israelites were giants, so I don't
No.
think we want
So
to look at
Anakim, Rephaim, Nephilim, and then you've got the Israelites, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I make that sort of distinction just because there's tribes that are giants that have the same name as the hybrid human and giants do. So again, just try and keep it straight. I just wanted to stick with something that made sense. And Gibborim, Seraphim, Cherubim, that means plural, male, plural, and ones. So this would be like giant ones, or Seraphim as in serpent ones, Gibborim as in mighty ones. And so if you understand it with that addition, not only plural, but as a kind, then it makes some sense. So in Numbers 13:33, the Nephilim are described as giants, or the children of giants, which is the word Nephilim, and that's in the embellished part of the report. Not that the part that Caleb and Joshua reported was inaccurate. This was trying to create terror amongst the Israelites because they understood, I think this is a testimony to the veracity of the Nephilim before the flood, that there were these monsters that they were going to have to go in. And so, yes, there were giants with Talmai, Sheshai, and Ahiman as Anakim kings that were cited there, but there were nations that were taller as well. This is showing the difference as part of the understanding of the hybrids versus the actual Rephaim giants. And how do we know that the Anakim were giants? Well, not only in the embellished report part, but in Deuteronomy 2, it talks about all of these different kinds of giants. Not all of them, but many of them, like the Anakim, like the Horim, like the Avim, like the Emim, like the Zamzuzim. And that word giant is Rapha. So Rapha is used in the Old Testament 25 times versus 3 times for Nephilim, and Rephaim is referring to post-Diluvian giants, not the embellished report that they're comparing these Anakim to be Nephilim and greater than what they would actually be, even though these were still giants nonetheless. So we get the word Rephaim used twice in the KJV translation, in Genesis 14 in the War of Giants, appropriate, and then in Genesis 15 amongst the mighty 7 and the mighty 10, where you have hybrids and you have giant tribes that are mixed in the land promised to Abraham between the Nile and the Euphrates River. The other times where you see giant in the Old Testament, other than Genesis 6:4, Numbers 13:33, except for once, the word is going to be Rapha, singular, Rephaim, plural. And so Gibborim is a word that's used to describe giants, as in Genesis 6:4 as the mighty ones, but not always. It's used like something like 158 times in Hebrew, but not always to describe giants. It could describe a nobleman, it could describe the power of God, or a power of the angel, or the angels excel. It has different applications. And David's mighty men weren't giants.
Right.
Right, same word. So, but there's a possibility that Uriah the Hittite or the Makathim that's listed, they may be giants or hybrid giants, but not the Israelites.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting that that word is used both ways. There's a very interesting usage of Gibborim in Ezekiel 32, where the mighty chiefs, but literally translates the chiefs of the Gibborim are in the midst of Sheol.
Yeah.
So it's that is a very interesting passage there that seems to describe.
Well, and that word terrible one. Yeah. That they're called because they did terrible things.
They caused terror in the land of the living.
Yeah, and were slain and are in the pit sides, the cells of the pit prison.
Right.
And so that's
I got somewhat speculative in the second coming of Saturn with that passage, but I think it's interesting because it almost suggests that these mighty men, these Gibborim, and the Septuagint translation makes it clear that it's giants that are in view there, because the Jewish religious scholars who translated the Septuagint in the 3rd century BC used the word gigos, giants, to replace that word Gibborim. It's almost like they've got a place of honor in the underworld.
Yes, absolutely, and more than honor. That's the Hebrew word erit, and as it's translated into English as terrible ones, plural, it would be eritim. And Erit is a word that means, has a lot of different meanings, all mostly applied to describing giants, just as they are described as the mighty ones, or Gibborim. And so it's used to describe giants in that application, in my opinion. And what's interesting about these, and it's got other descriptions as in stout, and words that go to strong and strength as in as and azaz. And as you understand that as being giants that are talking to another Rephaim royal bloodline, the Pharaoh, who is also classified as a terrible one in Ezekiel 32. This is a unique dual prophecy, as I explain what I think is a dual prophecy that has unique information from prehistory. That's important to understand, is applicable to the time of the prophet and has events that happen in the prophet and characters that are similar, but also has end time implications. And so I look at that as one of those sort of dual prophecies. And in the meaning of Erit is this term or explanation that they were childless and or fertility issues, as you take that back. And I use the full Strong's dictionary, the original, not the shortened version, so you can get the full context of the meanings in this book. And so that starts to get people to understand that these Rephaim, they had an inability to reproduce, and it seems to be manifested in the ability to produce females, and that they became increasingly more rare. And that's why they had to intermarry with humans so that they don't go extinct. Now, back to the word Gibborim, it is translated in the KJV once as giant in Job 16:14, as I recall the passage. And you could argue whether that's giant or not, whether it's accurately translated. I won't go either way on it. Biblically, it's safer to talk about the Gibborim as a description of the giants, as mighty warriors, right? Not that I would eliminate, because of the translation that's used in Job, that they were a kind of giant. And a backup information, and I use the Ugaritic text a lot in this book, so for the prehistory part, and I think you'll find a lot of overlaps on that, because it's written in original Semitic, which is the root language for Hebrew, and you can take words back to the original Semitic and the vowelless Semitic for the source words like Rephaim or Gibborim. And there is mighty that's used throughout the Ugaritic text as GBR in the original Semitic, but also there's a couple of passages that refer to a tribe of Gibbor. And because the parallel, and I cite that in the book, and because of that, I'm open to the idea that they were also part of the assembly of Jews you've covered, is the assembly of the Detanu. That's the visible assembly that the Baalim gods also have at Mount Hermon, and sort of connect all of that in. And then I take the Tanu and all of its various transliterations and into different countries as I can to explain who the Detanu are, and these other tribes of giants that are in this assembly, and other peoples that are listed in the Ugaritic text, like the Hittites and the Amorites, which would be the hybrids associated with them, and how we know that they're different than the Rephaim, or RPM in the original Semitic. And again, for people who aren't aware, if you hear the true researchers of the languages will say, don't say Nephilim, that's the Strong's pronunciation. Well, it's been an evolution. It used to be Nepal, so there wasn't that H in there, and that has been asserted and then changed to that F sound over time, just as RPM has the same thing. So again,
Rapayuma, in the Ugaritic to Rephaim, right?
Yeah, it's the same sort of etymological sort of history and evolution of the language. So I want people to understand the differences, and then to understand biblically who the demons, devils, and unclean spirits are, and how we know they're the disembodied spirits of the giants. And will I bring a little bit of the book of Enoch in after I explain it? Sure. Just as another source that I think there's a lot of words that go back to Hebrew, and we do have parts of the original Hebrew manuscript for Enoch, even though we have it in, in many other translations like Ge'ez and Greek and Aramaic and sources like that, not the original full manuscript. But, that word devil that's used in Jesus' encounters, that's used in combination with unclean spirits and evil spirits as interchangeable when he's dealing with these demonic spirits, that should not be translated as devil, in my opinion. The Greek word is daemon.
Okay, right.
Yeah, it should be
which
translated.
Which is where we get demon.
Yeah, which is where we get demon from.
Correct, yes.
And diabolos is the word for the devil.
Right, where we get the adjective diabolic or diabolical.
Yes. Yes, or evil genius, right?
Yeah.
And rooted in the devil. So
right.
So it's important to understand the difference between diabolos and daemon, and these are where we get that source word demon spirit. Well, what's interesting is we also get a Hebrew word that's called shed, or however you want to pronounce S-E-S-H-E-D, which is this evil spirit, and it's a demonic spirit as you take that back in its meaning. And then you have Rapha, that has several different listings in the Strong's Concordance, from names of individuals or giants as patronymic names, and you also have 7495, which the word is rooted is in meaning healer or medicine or doctor and words like that. So if you have the word Raphael as the angel that's listed in the Apocrypha of the KJV, that would mean healer of God or God heals. And so Rapha is also the term singular form of Rephaim and the Raphiu, the Raphium, all the different transliterations for the same people in the Ugaritic text. And not only were they giants in the Ugaritic text, not only were they dynastic kings, not only they're part of this assembly of the giants that reported to the assembly of the gods as the visible ones for the invisible ones, but they were also healers, and they could heal themselves as well as others in the Ugaritic text. So it's part of the root meaning, and so in the Ugaritic text, they translate that as healers. That's their preferred biases for it versus giant. But they're still talking about giants all the way through in the terms and the words that they're using. 7497.
I was going to say, it's clear in their texts that, and Amorites going all the way back to the time of Abraham, that they understood that these were spiritual entities, almost godlike, because one of the most popular names of the Amorite kings, I've found at least 5 from the time of Hammurabi the Great in the 18th century BC down to the last king of Ugarit, whose name was Amurapi III. That name roughly translates as Amu, meaning my kinsman or my fathers, and Rapi, which is Rephaim. My fathers, my ancestors were the Rephaim.
Yeah, you'll be happy I break that Hammurabi name down in all the possible sort of meanings that you could break that out into for the understanding, because they're all kind of interconnected no matter which way. You could also even connect that as, because you can see Hammurabi spelled with an H or without the H as and then you could also spell that starting with the Hebrew where it would be C-H-A-M as in Ham.
Right.
And so there's lots of different ways, but just throw everybody out that there's meanings in these words, and is why I look at it that way. And so 7497 is sourced out of 7495, meaning a giant, right? And that's the Rephaim as we understood as it's translated. Now, 7496, the word in between, also sourced out of 7495 from the healers, is an evil spirit. A disembodied spirit. And so it's all part of the meaning for the Rephaim, because you can't define 7497 as healers, but it can have healers involved in its meaning as a giant and a healer, and as the spirits are sort of understood. Now,
I once asked Mike Heiser about that, because he wrote the section in the Faith Life Study Bible on the Rephaim. He wrote the article about the Rephaim, and this was early in my study. I said, Mike, you've got some scholars saying that there are no examples in or out of the Bible of the Rephaim doing anything that looks like healing, and yet that seems to be the default definition that we encounter when we try to look up what is the etymology of this word. And Mike says, it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both and, which is exactly what you're saying.
Yes, and it's very important to understand that. And I like to take the source words back on a meaning, but not to have it completely defined by that meaning. It has an involvement in it as an extension. So like Nephal and Nephilim. So I make sure there's a distinction there as well. And back on Nephilim, so a lot of people say, well, you can translate Nephilim as a tyrant or as a bully, as well as a giant. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's a giant. You are correct, but again, all of those words give you a fuller meaning to the word Nephilim as a giant. So if you look at the word bully in the Ugaritic text and in other cultures, and I talk about this in the book as well, is that the gods like Baal were called bulls.
Yeah.
And
the
their
father of their
offspring were
gods,
called
El,
bulls as well.
Yes, and the father of their gods is El. That was main epithet was Bull El. So
yes,
that was and even getting to the Ditanu, the scholar Amar Anus pointed out that name probably derives from an Akkadian word for the aurochs, which was that ancient strain of cattle where the bulls were absolutely huge. The aurochs bulls were about 6 foot at the shoulder. And
stocky and strong is part of that description, right?
Right. They went extinct around the 16th century, but there's a German woodcut from around the 15th century showing how you would hunt an aurochs. Basically, get yourself a long spear and a big stout oak tree, and then stab the bull from behind the tree, so when it charges, it doesn't kill you. That's who's in view here with the Ditanu.
Stout is the key word there.
Stout is the key word.
And I will go in many applications highlighting stout as it's used in the KJV and the word it goes back to, and words that include stout, not as in fat, but as in muscle, wide, and strong, because they had a 2-to-1 height to width ratio using Og's bed and as a standard for that. So the humans were generally 3-to-1, so they were full third or 50% wider as well. So so when you look at what that meant for Og and his bed, and then extrapolate his size from 12 to 15 feet, depending on which cubit that you want to use based on that bed to fit in, and then the bed would be 7 feet wide, so he's going to be 4 to 6 feet wide. So, and it was like 4 cubits wide and 9 cubits long. That's that 2-to-1 ratio, and also made of iron because of his weight. So the wood wouldn't hold it. And so bull, when it says bully, it's talking as like the bulls, the Rephaim, or the giants that are in the Ugaritic text, and whatever gods that El had produced before the flood as a parent god versus the offspring god after the flood. And the word tyrant, and I've seen several different versions of this and walk people through how we know that tyrant is a description for giants. So you have the term Hebrew prince as Sar for a prince, and the Sarim for the Philistine lords, and a connection back to the Gyges or Gyges kings. The Y sound is the plural. So, and I walk through that so people understand why you have Gyges and Gyes with that sound. It's just whatever vowel follows that G dictates the sound as a Y or a hard G in Greek. So plural for Gyges is Gyes, as giants.
So
now
in a nutshell...
That goes back to the Gyes or the Gyges kings of the Herculides and other bloodlines that go back to Zeus and to alchemy as the daughter, so post-Diluvian bloodline dynastic kings, and kings that were in not only in the Greek area, but also in Assyria and in Asia Minor, and they were known as Tyrannos in Greek and Tarwanas in Anatolian, for the same bloodlines and the same kings and the same people that is connected back into Sar as having an understanding as a tyrant, as it's understood in the Bible for those kings, as part of the same type of Greek bloodlines, understanding that the Philistines migrated from Crete, which was part of the Greek Empire.
And there's a scholar by the name of McLaurin who years ago wrote an etymology of the word anax, which is where he argued the word Anakim comes from. And the word in Greek, anax, refers to a dynastic ruler or a hereditary ruler. So the Anakim who ruled the high country of Israel and Judah, which is was the focus of Joshua's war. You can read the summary of Joshua's conquest of Canaan in Joshua 11, beginning at verse 21. It says that all of the Anakim were destroyed from the hill country of Judah and the hill country of Israel. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did some remain, which are the Philistine territories, which makes sense if the Anakim had a Greek connection there. And McLaurin actually went into the comparisons between the Greek terms anax for a hereditary ruler and a tyrannos or tyrant for a local, say, civic official who's given the right to handle all the day-to-day details. He's not the king, but he's like the vizier, okay?
Yep.
And there were Philistine terms, which you were sarim, and there was another one that I am forgetting. Seren.
For the Seranim.
Right. And he argued that these were essentially cognates, the Hebrew cognates for the Greek terms. So
well, they seem to be words introduced to the Hebrew language.
Yeah.
There's an explanation how they show up, and from the Philistines, from the Indo-Aryan language that they would have spoken.
Sure. And the Hivites, and this is something that was very interesting to learn. Mike Heiser brought this to the Sons of God Giants of Old conference back in 2019. Research by a fellow whose name I'm going to forget. The book is very, very hard to find. A German scholar. It was translated into English, but you can't find a copy of it anywhere. But I've seen other scholars who deal with the Hittites who've made this connection as well, that the Hivites who show up in the Bible in a number of places in Genesis and Exodus, probably a Hebrew derivation from a Luvian word, and Luvian is an Anatolian language that's modern-day Turkey for Ahiyawa, which referred to the Mycenaean Greeks. So in other words, Agamemnon and his group were the Hivites who attacked Troy, and they were in the Holy Land before Abraham got there. So we shouldn't be surprised at this overlap between Greek religion and the Hebrew Bible. So when we see these demigods like Heracles and Perseus in the Greek religion, as Amar Anus, the Estonian scholar, wrote in 1999, yes, there are Greek Rephaim. The Greeks understood where their gods came from. And as the poet Hesiod wrote, the daemons were the spirits of the men who lived during the golden age when Kronos, king of the Titans, the Ditanu, ruled in heaven. Their spirits went forth on the earth and were daemons, and they gave gifts to humans and protected us and were nice and kindly as long as you sacrificed to them and all that. It's just Hebrews and Jews who got that word from the Greek. Demons had a better understanding of what those spirits were, and Jesus made that clear during his ministry. Yeah,
and how you kind of get there with Titan as a connection to the Ditanu is the D and the T in some cultures were interchangeable.
Right.
So you could get Dedan as being the same.
Yes, it is.
Yes,
it's the same.
And you could get Taduwa as being the same as Danuwa as the same. And so, if you can look for some of those patterns, it sort of helps you trace that back.
Dathan, one of the rebels against Moses, that's the same name.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I do mention the Luwians and some connections into the language and stuff in this book
Looking
as
very
well.
much for In fact, while we're talking here, I've just bought the Kindle version of your book. So
thank you. Appreciate it.
So just in a nutshell, to wrap up for the first section, we'll probably have to do another program on this at some point because I know we've only scratched the surface. But just laying the foundation, the giants of old, literal hybrids from the unholy union of fallen angels and human women, their spirits after the flood referred to as Rephaim, but also the post-flood giants based on a second incursion. referred to as Rephaim, and also Anakim that were counted as Rephaim?
So, yeah, I look at Nephilim as being antediluvian giants. I'm open to the idea that some may have survived somehow, some way, but I lean heavily towards a second incursion, and specifically for the Rephaim name with Baal and the Baalim and the Council of the Gods. And so it's Baal and Anat that are doing the second incursion of giants. And one of the reasons why they're doing those fertility rituals is to bring Baal and Anat back. And that's because they're gone. Why? Because they did the same crimes. So sometime after the flood, maybe just before Babel or a little bit after, they kind of disappear. So when this fertility issue comes to fruition, they're wanting to bring their celestial mafia godfathers and mothers back to produce more giants, but they don't come back. Why? Because they're in the pit prison. And what's also interesting in that Ezekiel 32 passage is when it's talking about the mighty that are talking to Pharaoh, which are different than the terrible ones. That's the Hebrew word El. And probably referencing to the angels that were sent there both before the flood, and then if there's a second incursion, as I make a case for, is the most likeliest way they show up after the flood, that those angels would have gone to the pit prison as well.
Interesting. In that passage in Ezekiel 32, something I stumbled onto or was led to, I suppose. Ezekiel 32:18, Son of man, human one, wail over the multitude of Egypt and send them down, her and the daughters of majestic nations. That word translated majestic in Hebrew is Adarim, which in the Ugaritic texts refers to a class in the underworld, noble ones.
Yeah.
The noble ones, a term found in Ugaritic texts that refer to a divine class in the netherworld. So Ezekiel knew more than the English translators understood.
Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely. Or we're limiting it to because for whatever reasons, right? So,
Well, I know we've only scratched the surface, Gary, but I guess to just put a wrap on this particular discussion, what do you hope readers will take away from the Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2?
What I want them to take away is how preternatural the whole Bible is, and that the Bible is accurate, and that you're going to learn not only what happened, but you're going to understand what our reason for being is and the reason why we're created, and how, as the descendants of Adam and the descendants of Noah, that we are the resolution to the angelic rebellion. God knew the angels would rebel. He knew everything that they would do. And he created us as the solution and the resolution for that rebellion, which happens in the end time with, I think, all of the angels except for Satan, who has a delay of 1,000 years, and then goes to the lake of fire. And that if we don't understand how this world works, from a biblical lens to what we see out in the polytheist world, then we're going to be deceived, and we're not going to be prepared for what is coming, and we can't imagine what's coming. So this will help you to understand what was and how that fits into end time prophecies, because these terms that I'm using in the first half of the book, I'm going to use that to expand the understanding of end time prophecy in the words like the great men, for example, because unfortunately the New Testament is Greek and the Old Testament is Hebrew, so you have to look for words that are cognate with each other, that are a match. And so I'm going to show you how we know the great men through Megasthenes and Megas is talking about these mighty ones that connects to the same prophecies in the Old Testament and back to the giants and the dynastic bloodlines of the giants.
Fascinating. And like I said, I just got my copy, and I'm looking forward to reading this over the next few days because this is right in our wheelhouse. And I'm glad you put the footnotes at the bottoms of each page, because that is something that, maybe I'm weird. Sharon and I are the same way. When we read something, we want to look at the footnotes right away rather than have to, bookmark it, go to the back of the book, look it up, and then go back.
Well, people stop doing it. They just get tired of doing it. And
I agree.
It's a little easier on the Kindle version where you just click on it and you get it up in front of you. So, but the reason why, and I know that you're aware of it, is why publishers don't want to do that. It costs more money.
Yeah, it's more difficult in the layout, but we insisted on our most recent books, and we were happy that the publisher was willing to go along with it, and we're friends with the publisher, so that doesn't hurt. Gary Wayne, the author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, Part 1 and Part 2, now available, and you'll find links to both of those in the show notes below this video or audio, wherever you're consuming the podcast. Gary, thank you again for your time today, and we will have to do this again sooner rather than later.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and invite me back anytime.
Check the notes below this podcast for a link to Gary Wayne's new book, The Genesis 6 Conspiracy Volume 2, a valuable addition to your reference library. Really complements the first book, and highly recommended. Coming up, well, we are in Israel as you are watching or hearing this, so we appreciate your prayers on that. A couple of conferences to tell you about, but also a protest that was delayed at the University of Washington. Why? Because the protest was too white. Yes, too white to protest, apparently, in the progressive paradise of Seattle. That is straight ahead as A View from the Bunker continues. Summer reading season is just around the corner. We want to help you get ready.
You can buy fiction, you can buy nonfiction through the Gilbert House store, whichever you want. All of our books are 40% off. 40%.
That includes all 8 novels of the Red Wing saga.
Book 9 is coming, probably early summer.
My 2 novels, and then, of course, all of our nonfiction stuff, including our most recent books, Giants, Gods, and Dragons, The Second Coming of Saturn, and Veneration, a deep dive into the cult of the Nephilim.
April and May, you get 62 days.
Absolutely.
No, 61. April only has 30.
Regardless, through the end of May, 40% off on all of our books at the Gilbert House store. Available only online. Go to gilberthouse.org/store. You'll find all the prices slashed on our books, 40% off, gilberthouse.org/store. And thank you for your prayers and support.
God's creation is full of mysteries. What were the giants in the Scripture? Did dinosaurs roam the earth in the days of Noah? Are we alone in the universe? Join speakers Derek Gilbert, Rudy Landa, Michael Hoggart, Greg Patton, Mac Dominic, Josh Davis, and Micah Van Huss to explore the topics your Sunday school teacher didn't talk about at the Mysteries of the Bible Verse event in Cincinnati, Ohio, June 7th and 8th.
The internet to think. Every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. We're online at VFTB.net, gilberthouse.org, my personal website, DerekPGilbert.com. You'll find us on social media, X, formerly Twitter, at View from Bunker, at Derek Gilbert, and at GilbertHouse_TV, at GilbertHouse_TV. Soon we will be adding these videos to X as well, and that will be the account where you'll find these programs as well as Unraveling Revelation. We're also on Facebook, View from the Bunker, Truth Social, Gab Me We Get Her, at Derek P. Gilbert, and on YouTube at Gilbert House. Subscribe, share, click the button for notifications, the bell that is, and then cancel-proof yourself by downloading our free mobile app. That mobile app gets you all of our video and audio content going back to 2005. All the new content, anyway. The archives are being uploaded as time allows, but we get quite a bit from the old days back there. First interviews with the likes of Tom Horn, Mike Heiser, L.A. Marzulli, and more. So do check those out and bring it into your smartphone or tablet, from which we will never be canceled. So guarantee that we never get canceled by getting our app. You'll find it at gilberthouse.org/app, gilberthouse.org/app, or VFTB.net. Check the top menu bar there at the website, and you'll find a link to get the app that is right for your device. Well, at the University of Wisconsin in Washington, a couple of Thursdays ago, they were planning on an encampment as the pro-Hamas protest, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic protests have been spreading on campuses around the country. Kind of begs the question, who's funding all of this? Don't know if you noticed the protest at Columbia University in New York City. Students there at the encampment all had matching tents. Does not seem like a grassroots type of encampment. Somebody bought all of those. Fox News tracing the money, finding it's coming from 501c3s connected to, surprise, surprise, George Soros. But the story in front of us today, which just highlights some of the silliness that's going on here, signaling virtue more important than actually accomplishing anything. The University of Wisconsin, University of Washington, that is, University of Washington Progressive Student Union, PSU, announced that they had to postpone their encampment, which was scheduled for a week ago Thursday, because there were too many white students involved. Somebody had noticed and pointed out that they didn't include enough Muslims and Arabs in the organizing, and so they called the whole thing off. We cannot protest this thing because there aren't enough people of color involved. All right, I suppose if you're going to protest on behalf of Palestinian Arabs, maybe you want to have some, Arabs and maybe some Muslims involved. This just speaks to the nature of many of the progressive causes here in the United States over the past 4 or 5 years. It's mainly pretty well-off liberal white folk who are behind the whole thing. Why? Well, that's beyond the scope of this particular rant, but still, it is quite amusing. I mean, University of Washington administrators had told Jewish leaders on campus that they weren't going to intervene unless things escalated and personal safety got involved. But this is what's been happening at many other college campuses across the country. School administrators taking the coward's way out, letting the protesters dictate academic operations. University of Southern California has called off graduation. So the 2024 seniors now, who likely graduated high school in 2020 and didn't get a high school graduation because of lockdowns, now being kept away. So we can't protect you. Rather than protect the students who've earned this degree and their parents who want to go there and show their love and support and pride in their students accomplishing this thing, now being said, nope, because these kids might get violent, we're just going to call it all off. We'll let them control what's happening on our property. It boggles the mind. But at the University of Washington, like I said, it's gone to they've turned it up to ludicrous speed, cranked it up to 11. The predominantly white Progressive Students Union opted to call off the whole encampment to make sure this encampment is a better reflection of the UW community and having even greater unity with Muslim, Palestinian, and Arab students. Basically, what you got here, and credit where it's due, Jason Rantz, talk show host at 770 AM in Seattle, what you got going on there are warring factions of anti-Semitic extremists squabbling over who gets credit for demonizing Israel and Jews. Bless their pointy little heads. Well, as I mentioned, we are in Israel as you are watching or hearing this, likely. Assuming you are watching or listening within close proximity of the release date of May 5th, we will arrive in Tel Aviv on the 6th. We'll be there through next weekend. There will be a view from the bunker next Sunday night as well. I'm working ahead to put these out, but our other programs, PID Radio, our Gilbert House Fellowship Bible Study, those will be on pause until we get back the weekend of the 18th and 19th. Unraveling Revelation still broadcasting as per usual, and you can keep up with all of that at our mobile app. We will be in Cincinnati in June. That is our next bit of travel for the Mysteries of the Bible Verse Conference. You saw the spot here just a few minutes ago. Looking forward to that. I'll be speaking twice, including giving the keynote address on Saturday the 8th, talking about Lucifer and why Lucifer is not Satan. He might be even more dangerous. Talking about giants in the Bible on Friday, June 7th. This is at the Marriott Cincinnati Airport Hotel. It's in Hebron, Ohio, so just south of Cincinnati, across the river in Ohio. Hebron, Kentucky, excuse me. It's on the Kentucky side of the river. Anyway, information and registration available at swrc.com, swrc.com. DerekGilbert.com. We'll be at the Finley River Ranch for His Call Ministries in June 21st and 21st through 23rd. Sharon and I will be speaking that weekend, Friday night, Saturday morning and afternoon, and then again Sunday morning. So we hope you will join us there for that. This is the theme of the weekend will be the gates of hell. We'll be talking about what they are. Are they physical? Are they metaphorical? What are they? Where are they? That's basically the weekend. If you want to spend a weekend in a rather cozy environment, intimate environment, ask us questions and hang out with us. Please look up hiscallministries.com. Contact them for more information and to reserve your place, hiscallministries.com. Then late July, we'll be at the Go Therefore Conference in Dayton, Ohio. That's Brookville, just outside Dayton, Ohio. The Harvest Revival Center. Dr. Greg Reed, Dr. Judd Burton, Pastor Carl Gallups, Pastor Paul Begley, L.A. Marzulli also speaking there. Dr. Mike Spalding as well. And hope to see you there, July 26th and 27th. This one will be streamed on the web as well. So if you can't be there in Dayton, consider getting streaming video for that. You can find out more at GoThereforeConference.com. We'll be in North Dakota in September, or at least I will be, and we'll be, of course, returning to Israel, God willing, next spring. Information on that available at gilberthouse.org, or look under the calendar tab at our app. Again, you'll find the app at gilberthouse.org/app. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen. If you're listening via any one of the main podcast sites, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Audible, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, wherever you find fine podcasts, we appreciate you taking a moment to give us a good rating, a review if you've got an extra minute or two. Like the review page or like the View from the Bunker page, that is, at Facebook. And just a reminder, our announcer, the inimitable D.C. Good. A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And good night, Oliver, wherever you are. I'm Derek Gilbert. This is A View from the Bunker.